Great. So really good to be with you here today, James, and to talk about this really important topic. And I really appreciate you taking the time and courageously sharing your experience, actually, which is quite dramatic, as we'll find out. I wanted to say a little bit about the aims of what we're doing before we start. So I guess we're trying to raise awareness around adverse effects from meditation and specifically meditation induced psychosis and the complexities of that experience, to raise awareness to hopefully help other people who might be experiencing this type of phenomena, the complexity of it, that it's not as simple as it's sometimes portrayed, and then the support, really, how to support people going through this, and how meditation communities could learn and do more. The only other thing I wanted to say at the beginning was just to name that you and I are working in therapy. We've been working together for a couple of years. It was actually after you'd recovered from the experience, we started working together and to sort of process and stabilize and move forward from that. But we'll probably touch upon parts of that seem relevant to what we're talking about. I'd love to hear from you, though, a little overview of what led you to meditation retreats, up to the first experience, and then we could go through what you went through as well, if you want to as well. And it'd be great to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I probably sort of first dipped my toe into sort of the mindfulness world around kind of 2015-ish, 2016. But was definitely more along the lines of kind of just practicing sort of 10 minutes every day with an app or something, and finding it useful for my focus, for my well-being, and was helpful for my studying as well, I think, at the time. It also linked up a bit to then discovering a bit more around kind of I was studying psychology and getting interested in acceptance and commitment therapy. So I think that as well at the same time sort of got me more interested into mindfulness and meditation. And then probably started taking my practice a bit more seriously, or practicing more and getting more into the sort of slightly more esoteric sort of literature, or the slightly more spiritual side of mindfulness practice, probably about 4.5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago now. Probably over 5 years ago, really. So started practicing a bit more, being a lot more interested, reading a lot more around it, and then beginning to attend sort of initially, I think, like 1-day retreats, and then gradually building up towards attending 10-day retreats. So yeah, it was quite a gradual build into the practice, I think.
Yeah. So really come into the practice like many people do for stress relief, focus, and then finding more to it as you went through it and kind of explored more. And so we've talked about your first retreat experiences and actually how rewarding they were, and it might be worth sharing that actually those first few experiences were, for all intents and purposes, very rewarding, very useful experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I still can take a lot from those experiences, and I still think that they were some of the most transformational experiences, really, in my life. They've had a profound impact on me, and I think not just in terms of the experience on the retreat, but actually then how that's gone on to be integrated into my life and my perspective on certain things within my life. I think definitely is informed by some of those experiences, for sure. And I have very fond memories of some of those times on retreat as well.
Yeah, which really shows the complexity of these types of experiences, that you can have something that was so rewarding and you felt you were getting clear signs that it was influencing your life in positive ways. It had practical benefits in terms of activities and things you were doing, studies, but also relationship and connection. And then yet you end up having a very different experience. So if you're happy to talk about it, it might be worth us walking through the more difficult experience. Start wherever you want to in that process. But yeah,
I guess so. It was probably, well, it was my second 10-day silent meditation retreat. And I think perhaps also some of the backstory of some of the things in my life are relevant here as well, in terms of the sorts of stresses that I was going through, and some of the events in the sort of 6 month year leading up to going on that retreat. I think it were kind of relevant in terms of the context. I think I maybe approached it with a little bit more of a focus on sort of turning towards some of these things and actually processing some of the things that have been going on, but also I think like I was taking my meditation more and more seriously. So perhaps on that second retreat I was also I think I wasn't necessarily, I had a clearer idea of what to expect, having been on a retreat before. And I would say that the first 6 or 7 days, at least, I think the first week really was actually, I would even look back at some of those moments as actually still being really helpful and I still value some of those days on that retreat as well. I would say then building into kind of a certain point where I feel like I began to sort of lose touch with reality, really, I guess, around having I mean, we've spoken previously about kind of the experience and having a kind of a feeling of sort of everything going completely blank, and then sort of coming from that and feeling very, very sort of free and very equanimous and open and sort of an ease of practice at that time. And then I think it was as that started to sort of pass was when maybe things started to just become a bit untethered. So I would have felt like I was sort of finding it harder to stay grounded, I guess. Through that, and a lot of intense emotion was coming up for me, and probably would then start to yo-yo between sort of very, very intense feelings of elation and euphoria, to sort of quite intense negative emotion coming up, and sort of fear. But because I was still in kind of silence, I don't think I particularly clocked it as being a problem at the time. It's more hindsight that I was kind of recognizing it maybe as the first signs of something sort of going off track or starting to sort of lose that grounded sense.
And in some ways, your experience to that point had fitted a lot of what you'd read in meditation literature, famous teachers describing progressive insight and other meditation maps. And, you experienced what some people would describe as cessation, and then, the kind of equanimity afterwards. So in some ways you were experiencing a lot of what you'd, read about and some things that were the same as the other retreat that had been very positive. And, it's not uncommon for strong emotions to come up in meditation practice, and to process difficult, traumatic, painful stuff, and then have energy and elation and high mood. So in some ways, like, it would have been hard to have clocked that, really, and to have known there was anything wrong. Wouldn't you say? Didn't it match quite a lot of what you were reading and things as well?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I definitely wasn't particularly concerned about what was going on in my experience at that stage. I was definitely trying to follow the general advice that I think I've received quite often throughout my sort of meditation journey, of just whatever sort of arises, just trying to remain calm and notice what's arising, and allow it to be there, without judgment and without getting caught up in it or carried away by it. And so I still felt like that was my goal, and that's what I was trying to do. But I think where maybe that then progressed was probably in two ways. I guess I was suddenly very, very intensely practicing. So in the opportunities to go for a long walk, or in the opportunities to sort of have lunch, I would have lunch and then go straight back to sit, or I would use a lot of the free time to sit as well. And I also felt like my sleep was probably greatly reduced at that time. So I was sort of practicing whilst falling asleep, but feeling like really I wasn't falling asleep for longer than maybe an hour or two. Coupled with the fact that then my waking hours start to take on a bit more of a dream-like quality. So yeah, it was kind of this combination of being a lot more in this middle ground, where I definitely wasn't sleeping as much as I ordinarily would, but also when I was awake, it was had a dream-like quality to it.
So starting to feel dissociated, and that merging of those sort of boundaries. And again, you were following often the advice, which can be to even be mindful right to the moment you fall asleep. A lot of teachers will talk about that on retreat, and to fit in as much practice as you can, and in some ways to do unbroken practice where you can, to keep doing it. And it's common for sleep to reduce on retreat, and all of these things again are within the kinds of stuff that would be taught and you would read about and you would feel. And yet they were sort of preceding something incredibly intense. I guess I was interested, did you have some interviews up to that point? You'd been talking to teachers to some degree at that point?
Yeah, definitely. I can remember sort of mostly group meetings. I think maybe one or two interviews, sort of private interviews. Thinking about the order of them, I'm not certain about the order necessarily. But as I say, it was kind of, when I remember some days of it, has that dreamlike quality. So in the same way, my memories can feel a bit bit of a mixture, really. But I remember one group meeting and having this sort of intense feeling that I was kind of flickering in and out of existence, even as I was speaking in the meeting, and trying to describe that in the meeting, and also describing that I felt like really didn't have much choice over or control over that, and that I kind of decided that my only option really was to kind of surrender to it.
Again, all things that can happen, and teachers would talk about and would discuss. And again, if you were anticipating that people who have meditation-induced psychosis are likely to have a psychosis history or something like that, like many teachers often think, you could hear all those experiences and think, yeah, great, that's all within the the maps and the progress. Whereas for you, we know you don't have a history of psychosis, do you? You'd never experienced anything like this before this, had you?
No, like no history and no sort of family history either of any.
No, and no significant traumas other than the ups and downs of life, and no problems with your mental health right before this.
No, yeah, exactly. This was probably my first experience of a real significant mental health challenge, I would say.
Yeah. So again, breaking the pattern of what sometimes this sort of experience is framed as, it's always going to be someone with a history that precedes it. So it shows that it's a lot more complex. And again, everything's within the realms of typical meditation maps and processes. So what then happened from there? How did it progress from there then?
Yeah. So I would say, I think the final group meeting, I definitely was talking in more dreamlike language, I think.
Yeah.
And was aware of like my experience taking on this dreamlike quality.
Yeah.
But I don't really think it was until the sort of last night of the retreat and the final day that then really the wheels started to come off in terms of my experience. And I think definitely that final evening I might have slept 45 minutes, but was just lying awake in bed, but felt like I was dreaming whilst being awake. And I'm really recognizing my mind really racing a lot of the time. I think on that final day of silence and that evening, like it was churning a lot. I think I was still quite mindful of the churning, but it was definitely and going off on these tangents of elation or fear or paranoia. Mostly elation, I would say, at that point. But definitely then towards the final day, as we broke the silence, just felt extremely disconnected and kind of teetering. And then I would say it wasn't until that final sort of group breaking of the silence where everyone then came together and started passing around like the microphone and talking about their experience that really I think it just became abundantly clear to everyone else that I was in the midst of an episode of psychosis.
So really kind of crept up on you, really, and not, you kind of gradually shifted into it, and then as far as I understand from us talking about it before, it's almost you're describing yourself, you're sort of not there really anymore, so you can't even apply, even if the traditional meditation guidance was to keep observing the experience and non-judgmentally working with it, you can't do that when you're literally gone, which is where it took you to, didn't it, to that really painful place where actually you weren't really in touch with your reality and you were doing behaviors that just wouldn't have matched. I mean, it kind of went on from there for quite a while, didn't it, with lots of experiences that were really outside of your control and awareness. And would you say anything about that? I mean, obviously you go into as much or little detail as you want, and don't need to share anything you don't want to, but
no, I'm happy to share that experience. So I would have felt that the pattern stayed the same of kind of elation and then extreme fear and paranoia. The other but probably a lot more delusional, so a lot more disconnected from reality, and actually probably the most defining characteristic of it was making connections out of everything and everywhere. so everything had some significance or importance in terms of a message for me, and that message would either be extremely positive and sort of would feel like, you know, I'm discovering the secrets of the universe kind of thing, or it had the nature of how everyone was, or there was this conspiracy, or people were trying to keep me trapped, or it was some sort of test as well. And I think that was particularly for that first sort of week following the retreat, feeling like I was being tested in relation, and particularly in relation to probably sort of like my experience as meditating. And so yeah, I think the one thing I would say in terms of how it was managed immediately, in terms of when it became very clearly apparent speaking in the group, I would say that was one thing that was handled well, in terms of with very little scene or very little sort of panic. It sort of was taken to a private area while sort of began to figure out what was going on, which I think was something that was really positive in terms of how it was handled, but definitely fed into the feeling of like I'm in some new test or some new environment of kind of
symbolically went into the psychosis and became part of it. And the person was supportive, the teacher. We're not going to name the retreat center or the teachers or anything like that here, because the point of what we're doing is really raising awareness and trying to expand how we work with this sort of thing. But the teacher or the person that went with you, they were quite supportive as well, you said, and to what you can remember. And
absolutely, very supportive in that moment, and sort of made contact with my emergency contacts, and sort of sat with me whilst waiting for them to travel to the venue over multiple hours, and also taking me for walks and exercise, which I could imagine would have been an interesting experience for them, because I think at that point part of the because I think earlier in the in the retreat, or maybe in the earlier in the retreat, there's been an analogy to sort of mindfulness and training of a puppy, and definitely being taken on walks by the people in the retreat fed into my psychosis of being a puppy, being taken on walks and being trained. So it would have been a pretty surreal and difficult one to manage, I can imagine.
Yeah, I bet. And so you can see how the whole experience was feeding into the psychosis, and that, you know, the way you describe it, there's the high oscillating of emotion, the sort of highs, and then the extreme terror and fear. And you've described to me it was, you know, beyond any anxiety or fear you'd sort of experienced in your life before, really. And so there's that kind of oscillation, and then there's this making connections, and the sort of delusional aspect of that, paranoia. Did you have any other perceptual phenomena or anything else in the psychosis?
In terms of like visual hallucinations or auditory hallucinations, no. I think it was more about the stories created around things that happened in my experience, whether sounds that I did actually genuinely hear, because they were sounds of like a train going by or something like that, or seeing things like what was written on a room key, or the place we were staying at. The chain of hotels, like the Jury's Inn, for example, was the place that we stayed, because it was too far to get home on the evening that after the retreat. And again, immediately I could fit this story around the test and going to like the Jury Is Inn,
Yeah.
And then a key saying on the key was like the key to happiness, the key card for the room. So again, I
Yeah.
feed all these things into my story. So
Yeah.
making
Yeah.
all these connections about my experience, but nothing in
Yeah.
terms of visual or auditory.
Yeah. Yeah. And we
Hallucination.
know psychosis presents in so many different ways, and often the delusional and the seeing patterns and things is, you know, a big part of it. It's just, you know, might be interesting for people to get a sense of, you know, the type of psychosis experience. And you know, and how it related to meditation and progress and things, didn't it? It
Yeah.
kind of fed into the whole sense of trying to achieve a goal and sort of enlightenment and things like that. So yeah, I guess, you know, we could touch upon what came afterwards, because there was quite a path to recovery, and it might be worth us at that point just thinking, you know, you've identified some of the things the retreat center did well, but we might be able to think about perhaps other things maybe in there. You know, I guess they did well, that there was someone supportive there with you. They took you out walking, they did the emergency contact stuff well. Was there anything else you think was useful there? And then maybe we look at the things that could be learned as well.
I think, yeah, the two things would be kind of taking me to a space in which I wasn't like surrounded by people,
Yeah.
being with me and sort of staying with me through that experience.
Yeah.
I think taking me actually and getting my body moving was actually a really useful thing.
Yeah.
And then before leaving out, one of the teachers did give me their email address. So was able to sort of after, it wasn't until after I recovered that I sort of made contact and had a video call with them, just to sort of describe my experience and thank them for what they did do.
Yeah. So there was some contact. I mean, we've both, when we've discussed this, we've acknowledged that it's difficult for meditation centers, and you know, what level of ongoing support is to be expected and things like that. But at the same time, you were a person in crisis, very severe mental health symptoms, in a way to have had some sort of ongoing check-in support, something a little bit more structured. I mean, in my mind, as a, you know, mental health professional, in some ways it amazes me that there's not more. That, you know, it's great that teacher reached out and made that support, but in some ways it amazes me there's not more of a structured way to support you, because we know that, you know, there's been, you know, we know that meditation adverse effects are common, and you know, we've talked about Cheetah House and Willoughby Britton's work and all of that stuff, and we know that actually the frequency that she hears about this stuff in her center and Cheetah House hear about this is a lot. You know, adverse effects and even meditation induced psychosis is quite a regular thing that they're hearing about, as far as I know from talking with those guys and hearing their work. So we also know from meditation communities that actually, if you talk to any of the long-term retreat centers, actually it's quite common that this sort of stuff can happen. And then we know that there's been some stories in the press about when this stuff, you know, people don't have such a good recovery as you experienced and a stable recovery as you experienced. And actually, you know, there's even been cases of suicide. So, you know, it's quite amazing in some ways that there's not at least a little bit more, even if it's handing over to medical health professionals and family to support. You would have thought there would be some kind of process there more to track these more severe experiences. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was actually even before I even attended my first retreat, I'd read that Willoughby Britton paper around the adverse effects, and for me it felt like something so far from what could be a possibility for me, because up until that point it was hard to imagine any adverse effects from my experience with meditation and mindfulness. And so and so yeah, I think, and that was then a paper that I shared with the teacher after I spoke with them after I'd recovered from my experience. But I certainly think that there could be more structure around how to respond when these things do arise. It definitely, I mean, I wasn't necessarily in the best place to sort of be aware of it, but it definitely felt like improvisation all the way through that. And I think also more around, I think I was pretty unreachable at that moment, but more around support for family members who were picking me up. I think there could have been a little bit more explanation as to what might have been going on, and why this might be sort of coming up, and also what could be helpful. I think it was very much about making contact with mental health services, but beyond that, as far as I'm aware, there was no real contact past the moment I left the retreat center. That was the last contact until I reached out via that email. So I think even just the curiosity to sort of know a week later how I'm getting on, even if it's not to contact me, but to contact my emergency contact and to follow that up. I think that would have been really appreciated.
Yeah, and I think for organizations that really preach, compassion, loving kindness, spirituality at the heart of them, it's again surprising that you wouldn't, feel more of a don't want to say burden of responsibility, but a sense of compassionate responsibility to sort of, check in and help and do what you can. And maybe this is just, I mean, there could be all kinds of reasons why this happens for this retreat center. And maybe we don't want to go into that today too much, but really the message is some kind of structured support, and maybe particularly around people who, are providing care and support and loved ones, emergency contacts, and checking in. And I think it's important as well, because we know from, the wonderful work that Willoughby and her team have done around supporting meditators in distress, and that there can be a huge amount of victim blaming. I mean, with an experience like this, it's hard to say, oh, you should have, you practicing wrong, or you should have done something different, because you're not there to practice anyway. But in other experiences, often meditators are told they're doing something wrong, or they're just not courageously sitting through the adversity long enough, or just because the teachers experienced some level of anxiety and they've worked through it, they think that applies to the students' much more intense anxiety, trauma experiences. So there can be this victim blaming sort of thing, which I feel passionate about. I've worked with many people and had many people contact me and reach out to me and things, and describe this stuff. So that's one thing I feel passionate about, that we need to sort of support people who go through this, rather than say they're either practicing wrong or they're just one of the soldiers of fortune and it's just the way it is. And because we'll touch upon it probably as we go on, but there's can be a lot of grief of losing that path and community and goal and everything you're working on, and then to be just left and potentially blamed for doing it wrong, or not having the courage to sit through something is, in my mind, incredibly problematic. Maybe that's a bit of a side note, a bit of something I feel strongly about, having witnessed that. Then should we move into your recovery phase then, do you think? Because you went through stages of, they wondered if you had like a tropical disease and stuff and things, didn't they? And that there was all kinds of stuff. And
and I think this is where kind of, like I said, I previously read that paper and was aware of the adverse effects, and if I would have been able to take a step back and see myself, and I could have kind of felt that given being having been on the retreat and being aware of this, it becomes very clear that it wouldn't have been a tropical disease to me.
Yeah.
And this is where I think that information from the retreat center would have been incredibly helpful and supportive. And I can understand that maybe there's like fear of being blamed, and that's definitely not what I would want to do. But at the same time, I think, yeah, having been then admitted into a tropical diseases unit within the hospital, and like having all sorts of tests done in relation to sort of my spinal fluid be tested, and sort of concerns about encephalitis of the brain. I think it's great that NHS was able to do that and rule out these things, but it definitely fed into a lot of my delusion around being tested and research and paranoia as well. So I think there could have been a faster track towards recovery if it had been understood a little bit more about how what was happening to me was certainly the retreat and the intensity of practice was certainly a factor in that. And I think if that had been understood earlier, and I think if could have begun to take those steps, which were very I was very fortunate in that it was very well handled by the NHS, and in terms of referral and eventually getting seen by the early intervention team, which were very, very instrumental in my recovery. I think in terms of both the sort of understanding what was going on, and also being able to sort of begin to piece together what some of those early warning signs might look like, as well as what are some of the things that are helping me recover, and really identifying those things so I could do more of them.
So what kinds of things came out of that in terms of recovery? What kinds of things were some degree of normalizing and explaining and framing your experience, but what else did they recommend that was helpful?
So I was always very reluctant to take any medication. I did get prescribed quetiapine early on, but before the dose got anywhere near what they were building towards, and anywhere near what they would prescribe for someone for psychosis, started on a tiny dose really, and I was already getting better by that stage. So at that point, they agreed that I would be able to sort of come off that medication, and so the main factors for me that I think really helped were being around family, so being in an environment that felt safe, so being at home, like being out of hospital. That was a big start of feeling like I was getting better. The other was exercise was a huge part of it, and actually getting in terms of feeling more sort of embodied, being able to exercise, go for walks and runs and things like that was massively helpful. And then I would say in terms of my symptoms, the transition really was as I sort of started to come through the psychosis. I felt that what was then coming up for me was just huge waves of anxiety, as I had memories of what had happened and how I'd been, which obviously in it, the delusion is so strong there's not much room for embarrassment. But afterwards, that's when I was kind of hit with these massive waves of sort of anxiety and embarrassment.
Yeah.
And still more, probably the last thing, the thing that lingered probably most was kind of this slight fear or paranoia, and not being as confident or as certain with say strangers I would see on a walk, or
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that was probably the last thing that sort of, as it began to unravel itself. Yeah.
Yeah, so your threat system had been on so high and seeing danger everywhere, and then it was easing and easing, and then there was the social threat around embarrassment, shame, anxiety over the kinds of things that you'd done in that state, and including things in your life outside, right? It affected, you know, other parts of your life. You'd ended up, you know, sending messages and things that you regretted, and things like that, didn't you? You told me about that, didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like sending messages, sort of conversations, definitely felt very confessional at a time during my psychosis. So yeah, I don't think there's anything that that I maybe had as a secret before then. That's all out in the open now, with family. So yeah, so pretty much I would say there were lots of things that were so far from how I would ordinarily behave. That naturally there's a lot of embarrassment and shame, and
and you know, we'll get into, I guess, the things we've been working on, but a big part of that was self-compassion for all of that, that actually that was nothing that you chose to do or controlled, or, you know, that was a really, really painful and incredibly overwhelming and difficult experience that you went through, and so to try and generate the compassion to that. I mean, I think you've had a playful relationship with it, because you've got friends, you've been able to be playful with what went on, and family and people who are supportive, and, you know, it's not that isn't, you know, a resource, but it's also having that self-compassion there, that actually, you know, that is not your fault, and you were following a path, and you're practicing the way you told, and you get in markers of what would happen, and then this big experience happened and took over. So yeah, maybe does that lead us into kind of our work a little bit, maybe, and thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe the only other thing to mention would be kind of sort of time frame, perhaps, of the recovery.
Yes, that would be good.
I so that would have been probably sort of first 24 hours was a journey of trying to sort of get home and get admitted to a crisis team. And so that included kind of hospital visits, en route home, all sorts of difficult experiences of having me in the car in the state I was in, and then eventually seeing, I think, first my GP, who I think, with the information that he had available to him, rightly concerned about encephalitis of the brain and some of these things. Having been, I'd recently traveled to a country where that could have been a potential thing. So then being admitted to the tropical diseases unit, and I think I spent I think it was 3 nights in hospital, but I would have to check that. But definitely multiple nights in hospital, and probably my recovery, at least 2 to 3 weeks, or probably 2 weeks of real psychosis, and then a couple of weeks of that sort of petering out, and then probably a couple of weeks of feeling very anxious and trying to sort of find my feet. The time frame is, as it was now, probably about 3 years ago. The time frame is isn't definitely not exact, but
something in that ballpark. And then
for sure,
since your recovery, you've stabilized, you've not had experiences of psychosis, have you? You've stayed?
No, I've had no psychosis since. And I think the other maybe thing before we go on to our work which has kind of been part of our work, but also just recognizing the impact that definitely had on my family, my girlfriend, and the stress that I know that the experience caused them. I think that was another thing that was really difficult to come to terms with after I sort of made a recovery.
And again, maybe with more awareness and understanding, some of that could have been lessened, or at least you could have sped up the process to the right team, and your family could have understood what was happening a little bit more, and that it isn't uncommon. It does happen. And I guess it just sparked my mind thinking another thing before we move on from that part of the journey, is that just for teachers to be aware that this kind of thing can happen when someone doesn't have the history. So yes, you want to screen for this stuff in intakes for silent retreats and practice and things like that, but being aware that actually you wouldn't have picked up anything in your screening that would have pointed at any of this stuff. And then also to be aware in interviews that, when teachers are interviewing students, that you could have seemingly markers of progress alongside difficult stuff. You could have both going on, or you could have like big markers of seemingly good stuff, like we've talked about things like feeling stillness and calm and focus and equanimity, or expansion and connection and love, and changes in sense of self that feel positive and feel like they could be transformative and good in the long run. And you could have all of that, and still, you might want to be looking out for markers around sleep and around hypomania or elation or other things that could be alongside all of that. So it's really adding to the nuance of it, isn't it, really, that, a lot of retreat centers now have mental health professionals on team, or people who trained in this sort of stuff. And the more we get that, the better, I think, to be able to pick up this stuff, because maybe you catch something like this earlier down the line, you stop the retreat, you start moving more, you start reconnecting and coming out of that stillness, that silence, that isolation, that lack of sleep, all of those things that actually in other contexts can produce psychosis. You can get psychosis in A&E because you're not getting enough, if you're in a hospital for an extended period, because you're not getting the right sensory, the right sunlight and things, and sleep deprivation and all the rest of it. So really just for meditation communities to be aware that this is more nuanced than it's always people with a trauma history or a psychosis history, or people who are practicing wrong and or have the wrong intentions behind their practice, when really it's not that. We can't blame the victims. We've got to build systems that support people through this. So so that impact on your family, and really feeling that, and you're a person that cares and really loves your family, and so you can see that that would be painful for you. I guess it leads into our work, and I guess you reached out to me knowing that I had worked with people with adverse effects from meditation, had a history of my own experience of that in the past, and I think it'd be interesting to know what led you to get in our work, and then we could think about the kinds of things that we've tried to do to stabilize even more and build other things here.
I think there are sort of multiple reasons for reaching out to you. I think one of the main ones was I had this kind of sense of grief or loss, really, around losing a practice that I had found so valuable and so transformative in my life, really, and had envisioned being a big part of my life for the rest of my life, really. So this interest in this area and things hadn't disappeared with the experience of psychosis. I think like trying to find a way that I could still sort of utilize it, that would work for me, utilize mindfulness and meditation that would work for me without or sort of minimizing the risk of these adverse effects. I think that was one big motivator. I think the other was probably finding a slightly healthier way to begin to sort of look at some of the, I mentioned earlier, some of the things that have been going on in my life before going on the retreat.
Yeah.
And I think I saw kind of one of the elements of my mindfulness practice as kind of self-therapy almost. And to a certain extent was useful in that way. But also finding other ways to actually begin to sort of look at some of this stuff and work on it.
Yeah.
So I think that was another motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, you know, it makes me think of some of the things we've worked on and some of the things that I think are useful with adverse effects. And I guess we began by, you know, really simplifying any practice and shortening it, and really having a very short, you know, even a few minutes, 5 minutes, because you wanted to keep that going, right? And you could see the value of it. You'd had so much value before. And, you know, both of us are big advocates of acceptance commitment therapy. And, you know, I'm a big fan of compassion focused therapy. And you were you know, you had used that in your work and were interested in those sorts of models. So there was a lot of alignment for us on that, in finding a way to practice that wasn't going to be intense meditative practice with specific goals, but it was going to be a practice that we hoped we could tailor to get more of those positive attributes, and really touching on the values below it. And, you know, I guess we were just being cautious with that, but knowing also that even with psychosis, severe psychosis, now ACT, CFT are major treatments for it. So there are ways of adapting practice. There are ways of making it trauma sensitive. I mean, you were a million miles away from that phase when we started working. You know, you're very stable and grounded and back in your life. But we were aware that, you know, there are ways of doing ACT and CFT practices that are very trauma informed, psychosis informed, and just making sure we were sort of aligned with any of that, and seeing what happened, you know, as we started practicing like that. And you'd kind of knew within yourself, I think you'd already started some short practice, hadn't you, anyway? So we just sort of built off that. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of your sense of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd agree with all of that, really. I definitely begun to practice, but I definitely wanted more confidence in what I was doing, how I was approaching it, and also quite critically why I was approaching it. What was sort of, I think what we've worked on a lot is kind of the values underpinning my practice and why I was practicing, which go back to a lot of the reasons I sort of started, in terms of that sense of connection, compassion, and even creativity as well, I guess sometimes. But that, I think that became a little bit more disconnected as I started to practice more and more, and get more into the literature and into podcasts, and it became a lot more of a exploration of this path or this journey that I was going on, and maybe sort of thinking that progress along this path would have really profound and useful impacts in how I lead my life, but it was less connected to my daily life compared to, I'd say, how my practice is now.
So that bringing it back to those core underpinning values, identifying how to either tap into those with the practice, i.e. shorten it, focus it, build it around specific skills that meet that. And I think focus and attention was another part of it for us. And I think, you know, there was something around the transcendent spiritual sort of domain that we, you know, tapped into with flow states, with connection to nature, with awe and other kind of ways of tapping into it, and trying to find ways to connect with those values in life affirming, connected, well-being enhancing sort of ways. I guess we then there was this piece around grieving what you've lost, and that's an ongoing thing. And I think for many of us who were very committed to a sort of path, and we're very dedicated in our practice, it can be really painful to lose that, to lose the communities, to lose the map around that. So I think grieving that has been something, and bringing self-compassion to that, hasn't it, has been a big part of what we've been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even with kind of before our work, having done small amounts of compassion practice, but very much in the kind of traditional lens of like a metta type practice, and was definitely not really as flexible with it as perhaps I think the way that sort of our work's been.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of compassion focused therapy, informed stuff, ACT and compassionate ACT, really inspired by someone who we both like, the work of Russ Harris and his compassion work. And we've sort of used different ideas there, mindful self-compassion and other kind of self-compassion practices and processes that don't have to be done meditatively necessarily, can be done very in life, and how to generate a more compassionate, supportive inner coach within us to meet the shame and embarrassment you talked about, to meet the grief of what you're going through, and also to help you move towards life you want to live. I think I'm sure you won't mind me saying that you're pretty socially connected, so that hasn't been such an issue. Some people I've worked with, the community meditation might have been their primary social connection, and then that's a huge loss there. You had a rich and connected social life outside of the practice, but actually bringing those skills and the things we're working on into social connection, really, rather than separating it, taking away, putting it in that context dependent learning of being on a cushion and sitting, but actually weaving it into life and being more flexible and less sort of like traditional meditation sort of approach is something we've focused on a bit as well, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned the benefit of exercise. You're a very physical person, so you had that. We've not needed to, I've learned from you, if anything, about exercise rather than the other way around. But that would be something I would work with people, is, okay, let's get a physical practice. And it can be a contemplative physical practice like yoga, but sometimes it's much more physical, lifting weights, running, riding bikes, doing things that might be a little bit more physical out there in the world. We've got videos on my channel around other ideas of things that can be helpful. So we maybe don't need to list too many more, at least from my perspective. But would there be anything else you would add?
No, I think they would be the big ones for me were around the flexibility of the practice and connecting it back to the values, the compassion related work, and the exercise as well as being like quite an instrumental part of being a lot more embodied. And then I think sort of one of the other things that's been more challenging perhaps has been, I think, this kind of we've spoken a lot about sort of those experiences of sort of expansion or openness in my practice, and definitely that was something that I felt like I wasn't part of my just like, it wasn't a permanent everyday state for me, but definitely something that I could and feel I can quite easily tap into.
Yeah.
But finding ways that do that in a balanced way, and making sure that that doesn't become something that sort of becomes sort of maybe less embodied, or less that flexibility, sort of dip in and out of those sorts of states. I don't know how you would maybe describe
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, I think you're describing it perfectly. That sort of expansive oneness type, no self, non-self, connected self sort of experiences, and then learning, because of the experience you've had, and not wanting to sort of go into a dissociative place with it, learning how to kind of work the edge of that, and be grounded in your body, and know that you can move in and out of it very freely, and come back to a more kind of anchored, grounded, dropping the anchor within that place, and move to and from that, so that you trust you're not going towards anything that could be too difficult. Not that we were expecting that, but just we wanted to feel confident around that, didn't we, as well. I think the other part was, it's not so relevant to you, because I think as you recovered, you reconnected with a lot of meaning and purpose in your life. But some clients I've worked with have been left in quite a, because they're in this sort of non-self spiritual, sometimes it tips even to a bit of an existential, meaningless, sort of difficult place, or it's like the only thing that's important is spirituality. Sometimes reconnecting with the valued actions, the hobbies, the goals, the people, that can be such a resource, even when our mind's saying there's no point, or I feel disconnected, I don't feel like I'm enjoying it, or I don't feel in my body. I think we haven't had to focus that so much, because you slotted back into that, but I guess that's been a benefit. You've had this broad range of interests and different things you do to connect.
Yeah, I think definitely having had sort of that background in acceptance and commitment therapy prior to any of this experience was kind of very instrumental in that recovery as well, and having for me, having that sort of values guided approach to life before meant that was really useful for me after as well. I think in that sense that really drove a lot of that that recovery before, and actually how my friends showed up for me through that as well, I think kept me connected to that side of things. I think it would have been a lot harder for me if I would have been a little bit more entrenched in a very specific religious framework, perhaps. And also if my community was linked to that religious framework, I think that made it a lot more difficult if I'd have just fallen out of that. And then, I think that's...
definitely. I think that's a good point. And sort of, I was also remembered the broadening of reading and podcasts and material we're consuming, because I think often when we're very going into the spiritual path or intense meditation path, we end up just focusing on reading and learning and studying more, or listening to teachers and things like that, and it becomes so focused on that one window, and opening it up and broadening it was another thing we talked about, and it's a common sort of thread in other people I've worked with.
Definitely.
Is there anything else you'd want to say today? Anything else you'd want to share on this, do you think?
There's nothing immediately that comes to mind about my story, just that I hope that this is helpful for other people that have this experience, and can see that that I've certainly feel like I've made a full recovery from it, and it's not impacting on my life anymore. And I've also found a way to practice that works for me. So
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your experience, your very intense experience here, and sharing that is courageous. And I think it will help people, and I hope it broadens understanding within meditation communities, mental health communities as well, about the nuance of these experiences, that they're not a simple thing. And hopefully we've given some ideas for recovery and things that could help, primarily being, professional mental health recovery as a priority, as a number one. And then hopefully we've given some other ideas of things that were useful for you, things useful from my work. There's other videos I've got on this channel and within the playlist on meditation, adverse meditation effects. There's a couple of videos that walk through a few more ideas on things people can do that might be helpful. So yeah, really hope this is helpful to people, and that people don't feel alone out there with these experiences. And yeah, I really appreciate your time, James. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Johnny.